Venom is a monstrous villain of Spider-Man's, a horrifying, single-minded, evil spawn of hatred who can appear suddenly without warning. His first appearance in the comics came in the late 80s, and naturally his popularity in the early 90s was taking off. Interest in Venom was huge, so when it came to creating the 90s cartoon TV show, it was important to capitalize on that popularity to get to show us Venom. The show, however, had in a sense a battle both with the strict restrictions for a children's show and of course managing to be story driven rather than strictly toy sales driven, a problem that was faced by many artistic property in that decade especially, going from attempts to being reasonable to being a fully child-friendly toys advertisement channel or show, even to the point of having nonsensical confrontations often. But the great MVP of that show, John Semper Jr., made sure the show's quality was tied into the story. A story with character-driven arcs that can span across episodes and even seasons, and being often as creatively loyal to the comic stories as possible. And because of those factors, we have with us the opportunity today to reflect on how this children's cartoon show still, nevertheless, manages to portray this heinous, haunting creature that is Venom. So today we're gonna look at the episode on the 90s cartoon show, the animated series that first introduced Venom, and talk about what we can learn from it, what it tells us about this character. Then we can contrast that, not with its original comic telling, but maybe with the Venom we see in the Tom Hardy Sony movie. Now, it is fair to say that there is some backstory for both Eddie Brock and the symbiote, both parties that make the whole that is Venom. And I covered both of these in some funny fast parody videos, but I will mention them as they come up quickly, and the links will of course always be below when needed. But for now, let's focus on all the points that this show gives us in less than 20 minutes about who and what Venom is. So the episode starts with Eddie Brock working out in his apartment, and we get this great shot of his wall covered in all these printed articles about Spider-Man, clearly displaying his obsession. He begins speaking of himself, Eddie Brock, and the symbiote in third person, saying, "Thought it was over with us, eh, Spider-Man? You made a fool of Eddie Brock whenever you could," and reminisces about all the times he feels he got humiliated by Spider-Man. There were these and many more. I covered all the times Eddie Brock gets humiliated before the 3-part alien costume episode, and like I said, it's a quick fun parody, so if you want, you can definitely click it down below. The links are always going to be there. Please do check it out, I think it's pretty fun. Anyway, but he also says, "And you rejected the symbiote. That all it wanted was to make you stronger, better, and help you reach your dreams." And from here, there are 2 episodes prior to this one showing what the alien costume's relationship to Spider-Man was, leaving it like a psychotic, jilted lover type of hatred of Spider-Man. He says, "Well, now we're together. We are one, and we're poison to you, Spider-Man. That's why we call ourselves Venom." And for the first time, besides the intro song, we actually got to see Venom. So we learn of their obsession and grievances, but also we learn of their grammar that they use. That now they are saying "we" to address themselves. And also, whenever they want to talk about Eddie Brock, they will actually say Eddie Brock. And when they want to talk about the symbiote, they will say the symbiote. Anyway, in the next scene, Spider-Man is swinging away, thinking about the date that he's going to be going on with the beautiful Mary Jane later. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he catches Rhino just standing there looking at him, and they begin a battle. But then Shocker shows up, and it's 2 against 1, and he gets caught off guard. But then suddenly and easily, Venom comes in and beats both of them before Spider-Man can even get up. And when he does even get up, he sees that both of them are already webbed. He wonders whose webbing it is, so whatever is an issue for Spider-Man can be no problem for Venom. Anyway, Venom, Eddie Brock with the symbiote, then introduces himself to Spider-Man and reveals that they know what each other does, so now Eddie Brock knows that Spider-Man is Peter Parker. Then they show Spider-Man what their combination of the two has become, a frightening monster, demonstrating that he can easily physically overpower Spider-Man, explaining to him that what we are is what you rejected. You rejected the symbiote, and Eddie Brock has embraced it. Spider-Man tries to warn Eddie Brock that the symbiote takes over and that he's gotta separate from it, but Venom says that they were made for each other because Brock's rage and vengefulness made them a perfect match. And as it seems, this is because of their unified hatred of Spider-Man in particular, as it connects both of their stories, the symbiote and Eddie Brock's. Venom explains that now they are part of a life force that has existed since the dawn of time. And listen, properly that doesn't really make any proper sense, but whatever. Something along the lines that the symbiotes have evolved through the cosmic ages, with knowledge across thousands of worlds and millions of civilizations that they will now share with Brock. Then Venom seems to swing away, but suddenly he sneaks up on Spider-Man. Now Spider-Man acts quick to get rid of him, but notices his spider sense wasn't triggered at all. Now, Spider-Man's spider sense is one of his greatest but underemphasized powers. It warns him to danger always, and now this horrifying enemy disables the one power that can actually protect him the most. And in the next motion, Venom proves not only is he more physically powerful, physically greater, but even the strength of his webbing is far superior to Spider-Man's. Venom then grabs him and lets him know that he could kill Spider-Man, but instead wants to save his death for later. Spider-Man addresses him not as Venom but Brock, which annoys Venom, and he demands he stops calling him that, and explaining a real truth, saying, "We wanted you, but you spurned us." Then claiming that they have big plans for him because they know everything about Spider-Man, but Spider-Man knows nothing about them. And this line though is actually 100% false. Spider-Man in fact knows a lot about the symbiote, at least enough about it, and knows enough about Brock. But we will see in this episode how it's that knowledge and the ability not of Spider-Man as a superhero with superpowers, but of being Peter Parker, a smart human being that allows him to overcome the odds. And while this video isn't about what we learn about Spider-Man, still it's in this confrontation in particular that we see the beauty of Spider-Man that has always been there, that he wins because he is human, often taking on multiple enemies that together are many times stronger than him. But in battles against Venom in particular, it is most clear that it isn't powers that lead Spider-Man to victory, since as he is here up against an enemy with the same power set as himself but multiplied in greatness. Venom vows to haunt Spider-Man before killing him until he sees Venom everywhere, even in his nightmares. Spider-Man realizes that the symbiote has completely bonded with Brock, and because it bonded with his own DNA before, his spider sense, his ultimate defense, is now down and useless against this overwhelming enemy. Instead of just waiting for Brock though, Parker immediately starts looking for a way to track him down. He looks for clues in Brock's old apartment and finds a receipt for gym weight rental equipment, remembering that Brock liked to work out by himself all the time. So knowledge of Brock coming into play here. Then he looks up the rental place and makes a call posing as Brock to confirm the new address for his new apartment where weights are being sent to. But while doing that, he hallucinates a sight of Venom in the phone book, recognizing that even after one encounter, he's already in such a state of fear that he's having visions of this monster. But he is a hero and presses forward, calling Atlas and finding the new address, as well as getting extra pictures of Brock from his workplace, the news organization that they both worked at, which probably had a lot of pictures of Brock from news articles that Jameson put out blaming Brock for having fabricated a story to frame Spider-Man earlier. Jameson at that time brings out his son while there to show everyone that his son will make a full recovery and that NASA plans to launch a satellite with a probe named after his son the next day in order to honor him, while at the same time insisting to his son that the black alien ooze that made them crash on their way back down from space that led to him being hospitalized was just a dream and that it will go away. Parker thinks about how this isn't a dream, it's more a nightmare for him, and talks explicitly about how disabled he feels now that his spider sense isn't there for him. He now feels vulnerable like never before. The show then gives us a beautiful shot of him walking by people looking at them, and in that short shot, the few seconds of it pass, it instantly portrays his insecurity and suspicion of everyone and everything around him, And just as he thinks that, we get one of the strangest scenes that I could only reflect on as an adult later in life why it was somewhat disturbing and haunting. Parker goes into an alleyway and starts changing, and we actually see it. We actually see Spider-Man taking off his clothes, and even how he makes a pouch with his webbing to put his clothes in, looking solemn in the way we all do when we feel we're alone just doing a mundane task. But he gets caught mid-change. It's Brock watching him while he changes. Now, up until now, we don't really see scenes like this. Why would we? There's no real action here. It's something boring. We didn't really get to see the actual changes, and to see Spider-Man mid-change with most of his costume on but his mask off is like catching someone actually changing, like catching them in their underwear, or right at the moment that they are exposed mid-clothing change. Sure, he's not actually fully naked, but being fully covered is how he wants to present himself. He doesn't consent to being unmasked. The mask is a protection of privacy that really prevents exposure of his loved ones who would be vulnerable. So for him, this is the same feeling as anyone else being caught by some creepy person staring at us while we change. Brock catching him in that moment, a moment that should be the safest moment anyone has, a moment we should be able to ensure our privacy, is when we are changing. Brock catching him mid-change with his mask off is an excellent scene, demonstrating that Spider-Man no longer has any protection, even in ways we, the audience, without a spider sense, would normally wish for ourselves. But it gets way worse from here. Venom, noticing how weak and exposed Spider-Man must feel with his identity being caught out like that, threatens to go tell Jameson, Peter Parker's boss, who hates Spider-Man, about his identity, thus taking the threat to Spider-Man's workplace. Spider-Man chases Brock to the Daily Bugle building, and a crowd builds, noticing that there seems to be two Spider-Men. Spider-Man tries to plead to Brock that the more you hate me, the more the symbiote can take control of you, and of course that is the reason of their unique and powerful bonding. We get a small fight scene between them, but even this small scene tells us something important, that Spider-Man isn't just smarter than Brock by book smarts, that actually while Venom is a huge powerhouse compared to Spider-Man, Spider-Man is still technically a smarter fighter. He has martial intelligence that Venom doesn't yet. Perhaps this is not so unlike a trained MMA fighter fighting a much higher weight class of a weight lifter who does have greater body weight and muscular ability but isn't the trained fighter, which perhaps doesn't even out the fight completely in this case of battle. It's still sufficiently in favor of Venom, but at least it shows how Spider-Man can, if he remains calm and patient and confident to face this huge monster that is obsessed to haunt him, that he can still put up a good fight. But anyway, Venom explains that the feeling of revenge is so satisfying to them that they want to take it out not just on Spider-Man, but on everyone he loves, including his Aunt May and Mary Jane, because they know everything about him. Then quickly he catches him off guard, webs him up, and in one of the most famous scenes starts dangling him off the edge of the building as he struggles helplessly. The crowd from before has media now, since of course it is the Daily Bugle building after all, and Jameson and Robbie are below. And then Venom strips Spider-Man of his mask, ripping it right off his head, as if to torturously expose him, now not just to his own eyes, but to the entire public. As sad and horrific music plays as his mask falls to the ground. Also, this one guy grabs a mask and is like, check it out, dude, I'm Spider-Man. Anyway, Jameson thinks quick and grabs a camera so he can zoom in and see Spider-Man's identity. Venom continues torturing Spider-Man, telling him that he'll be history once he's exposed, and to think of all those that he'll leave behind, like Mary Jane, his love, that she would feel so lonely without him, that maybe he should keep her company. And that is super creepy. And he even calls Parker Tiger, which is the loving phrase that Mary Jane calls Parker, as if truly penetrating into the personal memories of Spider-Man as Peter Parker, dangling him up and down in and out of the camera spot. Luckily, Parker manages to find something to cut himself free and swing away. He makes a makeshift mask and runs for it. Parker goes to the place he was supposed to have his date with Mary Jane, calling out to her, calling out her name, worried Venom might have gotten to her first to keep her company. He finds her and is relieved. She's okay. She seems safe. He apologizes for being late, but she says it's okay. I ran into someone who says he's a friend of yours. Friend? Of course, it's Brock. Complimenting her, making friends with her, maybe even flirting with Mary Jane a bit, saying she's a wonderful actress. Peter freaks out and shoves Brock. He grabs Mary Jane's arm and pulls away, saying they have to go now. Mary Jane is like, what's wrong? What's going on? And Parker keeps looking back, and when he does, we see what Parker sees. Venom, the monster, just casually stalking them, walking on the sidewalk. Mary Jane notices and is like, what are you looking at? She looks behind herself, but when she looks, no one is there. Parker says, look, Brock is just a weirdo and he'll explain later, but they gotta go now. With the haunting that is going on, it's hard to say whether the sight of Venom behind them just casually walking, stalking behind Parker and Mary Jane was a hallucination or real. But again, Parker sees a sign turn into Venom, knowing the hallucinations are still continuing to haunt him. Peter pulls Mary Jane, saying, I have to take you home now, as Brock follows. Mary Jane wants to know what's going on. The way Peter is acting doesn't make sense, but Parker says, look, do you trust me? She says, I think I do. He asks, then just do as I say and don't ask me any questions, please. And like the awesome friend she is, she just says, okay. And then she sits with him. She trusts him. He takes her home and goes home himself. Aunt May wonders why they came home so early. After all, she's the one who's interested in setting them up as a couple. But just then, the doorbell rings. Parker opens the door and there he is, Eddie Brock at Parker's home. Again pushing himself into every aspect of Parker's life. Nowhere is he safe, no place for rest, even in his own home. Aunt May wonders who it is, and Brock acts all nice, introducing himself as a good friend of Peter's and saying that he's heard all about her, in that taunting way that villains do, just to torture Parker, knowing what Brock really is. Parker pushes him outside as Brock says, be seeing ya, ma'am. Aunt May in her blissful ignorance says, what a nice man, so polite. Outside, Parker pushes Brock in the most serious tone, talking about the woman he cherishes the most on this planet, his de facto mother, Aunt May. He says, she won't be seeing you again. And the monster appears in his proper form, saying, how could you stop us? Then pushes down a tree that would hit Parker's home. Parker quickly gets up and catches it, then starts screaming out Brock's name. Venom watches in glee from afar, then leaves, as Parker eventually manages to push the tree back to its place. Parker knows that Venom will never stop torturing him, and he knows the only course of action is to fight back. Pleading with Brock to separate wasn't going to work. He has to put his plan into action. When Brock goes to his apartment, he finds that Spider-Man has changed his wall of obsession from pictures and articles of Spider-Man to pictures and articles of Eddie Brock. Maybe some real, maybe some that Parker made just to put on Brock's wall, just to aggravate him. Pictures and articles that blame him and of him getting fired. Spider-Man taunts Venom from the window, enraging them, and Venom blasts out the concrete wall, utterly destroying it to start chasing Spider-Man. After a bit of a chase, Spider-Man ends up falling into a subway station, and Venom tells him that it's time to end him. Spider-Man catches a train, and Venom jumps on just behind him, saying that they will catch him, that there's no place on Earth they can't find him. Which I think is an interesting callback, even if not done on purpose, to when Parker was his maximum evil, chasing Shocker, yelling that he can never be escaped, that he will chase Shocker to the ends of the earth. If you'd like, as I said, you can definitely check out those videos of Spider-Man turning evil because of the black costume. The links also will be in the descriptions below, and they're pretty fun. Please do check them out after this video or now if you'd like, and come back. Anyway, Venom decides to try to do something smart and crawls from the bottom of the train to surprise Spider-Man by showing up in front of him, but by doing that, he's actually facing his back to where the train is going and gets hit by a bridge. So naturally he steals a truck to catch up to the train, and of course he starts honking from the side just to let Spider-Man know that he hasn't stopped chasing him and certainly would never stop. He jumps back on the train. The train actually already makes it to the military base, which is where Spider-Man wanted to go anyway. He looks down, in a scene that I think is somewhat genius. Spider-Man looks down at his own shadow and waits till he sees Venom's shadow show up. And when he does, he jumps out of the way. It's only a few seconds and not really mentioned much, so I can't be certain this was done on purpose, but I believe this is another moment of Spider-Man using his human intelligence. No longer having his spider sense, he is now relying on the same human abilities we all have, using this technique of purposely showing his back, but waiting for the shadow of Brock to show up behind him in order to evade perfectly. Anyway, the base is preparing to launch the satellite that Parker had heard about on the day before from Jameson, so he purposely came here knowing that there was going to be a launch. Venom, on his single-minded track, hunts down Spider-Man, and despite some scuffle they eventually end up on a platform near the shuttle as the shuttle begins to launch. The roar of the rocket launching created the necessary vibrations that forced the symbiote to wither in pain. Venom screams out, "You tricked me!" and the symbiote comes off Brock. Spider-Man uses a special webbing technique to capture the bulk of the ooze and webs it to the rocket, then carries Brock to safety as the rocket lifts off. Brock is found in the elevator as Spider-Man stealthily makes his way to safety. At home, Parker sits with MJ as they look up at the night. Mary Jane comments about how beautiful the night sky is, that they must not be alone, and she wonders what's out there. And Parker, he says he's thinking about the same thing, as he sees the demon's face in the moon, as if waiting to one day return. So we learned quite a bit about Venom from this 90s cartoon show. Let's go over what some of those things are. First and foremost, Venom is not the symbiote. Venom is not Eddie Brock. Venom is the symbiote and Eddie Brock combined. You see, Eddie Brock on the one hand hates Spider-Man because he believes that Spider-Man's the reason why he's been humiliated so many times. And I covered all the times that Eddie Brock gets humiliated in this show before the 3-part episode that eventually shows us Venom. But it's still shown even in this 20-minute episode with that wall of obsession. Now whenever you see a wall of obsession in media, it's often actually used by media to signify to the audience that a character's pursuit of something or someone has now become an unhealthy obsession and has bordered on or well past the border of what we would consider sanity. Also, on the other hand, the symbiote kind of hates Spider-Man as a sort of jilted lover. In this episode, it's spoken about twice how the symbiote kind of feels as if it were rejected and it only wanted to make Spider-Man stronger and pursue his dreams. So it's kind of spooky in that sense, kind of like an ex-lover turned into stalker, but it's both of their mutual hatred. Even if they have that kind of hatred for different unique reasons, it's still what bonds them and makes their bonding purposeful and fast, obsessed only about destroying or becoming the poison to Spider-Man. That's why they call themselves Venom in this show. Now that's not the reason why they call themselves Venom in the comic books. Venom's name actually comes more so from a tabloid that Eddie Brock got forced into working for, after being fired from every other place. But we also learned that Venom's power set is pretty much what Spider-Man's power set is, except amplified to the nth degree. And so when it comes to Venom, I think the one word that comes to mind the most is the word smothering. Not only can Venom smother Spider-Man physically, get him in headlocks and be there at any point in time, he also smothers his enemy in terms of their life. Venom brings the conflict to every aspect of Peter Parker's life. Both his job place, his workplace at the Daily Bugle, even his romantic life, and even at home right in front of Aunt May. He really leaves Spider-Man no safety at all. But it wasn't just that. Venom was also able to penetrate into the one moment that many of us have sympathies for, a moment when we are changing. And that's really creepy if you think of it. So when it comes to Venom as an enemy, he's definitely going to be far more smothering in a most physical sense, and very much so when it comes to an enemy that tries to smother you, whether you're playing chess or doing martial arts or playing a
fighting game in a video arcade, when it comes to enemies that try to smother you with attacks from every single angle, the only recourse to have action is actually the most unnatural one, to stay calm and actually be patient and come up with a plan. And greatly, Spider-Man actually manages to do that. And that really is the key, because Venom is an enemy you can't just take on. Venom is an enemy where you can only have victory through doing the most unnatural thing, which is staying calm and patient and trying to outwit an enemy who can easily smother every aspect of your life and try to make you feel completely closed in. In any case, Venom is an overconfident, overpowered enemy that you have to outwit, or else you will be smothered pretty much to death. He comes out of pure rage and hatred of his targets. And because he comes at it from a kind of obsessive angle, it really makes Venom feel like a type of enemy that does stalking. So that's how we learned about Venom from that 90s cartoon show from the first time we saw him. However, he actually does come back in this show 2 seasons later and 27 episodes later. And when he does come back, it's really actually Eddie Brock at first getting therapy from Dr. Kafka, a woman who kind of does have faith in humanity, I guess you can say, and believes that even hardened criminals could actually be that way because of the psychological or mental difficulties that they might be having in life, which is a great kind of stance, positive stance to have. She does kind of think this whole idea of Venom is just a stress-induced hallucination, only until Brock gets that symbiote back and he becomes Venom. The thing though is that Brock at that time had already fallen in love with Dr. Kafka, so actually ultimately Venom does get a kind of redemption arc where he no longer is a evil enemy, but somebody who's actually willing to team up with his most hated enemy, Spider-Man, in order to protect and save this woman that Eddie Brock loves. Save her from an enemy that might be far more violent and vicious than Venom. An enemy that is actually more powerful than Venom and Spider-Man combined. Carnage. So we could talk about Carnage, we'll talk about him later, maybe, but I did find it really interesting how there's this kind of relationship shift. And definitely it does happen in the comics too, where Venom does have this kind of redemption arc. And certainly it does involve this kind of relationship shift with Spider-Man, where he's more seen of as a kind of frenemies. They have a frenemies relationship, where Venom continues to be a kind of threat to Spider-Man, but really they are willing to work together against a greater enemy, and usually that greater enemy is Carnage. But also in this cartoon show, I really did find it interesting how the kind of relationship shift happened. While the symbiote goes from really loving Spider-Man to hating him because he feels rejected, it goes to now really loving Eddie Brock and being jealous of Dr. Kafka and giving Brock these ideas of maybe hurting her possibly, so Venom now has to keep a kind of safe distance away from the woman he loves. So I think that's interesting. But also what's interesting is the idea that maybe Venom, who is born from hatred, born from vengeance and rage, all of that rage and hatred can actually be kept in check and overcome by Eddie Brock's love. I find it interesting that Eddie Brock's love can be greater than Venom's hatred. So that's kind of my interpretation of it, that actually turns Venom into a kind of anti-hero hero, one we can actually root for instead of thinking that he's just straight up evil like he seems to be in this episode. And in any case, I want to give great credit to the artists that allowed permission for me to use their art in this video. I will provide links to them below. Please go check out their galleries if you're interested in seeing more of their art. I think these pieces are just wonderful and awesome. Also, I want to tell you that I am now going to cover the Tom Hardy movie later, but I got to do a couple of videos without talking about Venom. Like, I did enough already. Give me a couple of videos without talking about Venom, then I'll cover the Tom Hardy movie Venom. So please actually like the video if you like the effort I put into doing all that stuff and whatever, and maybe comment too. It would really help me out in the algorithm. Subscribe if you can. If not, I hope you still enjoyed what I did here, and I hope you still enjoyed this discussion. I wish you peace. I wish you peace and victory.